You're now listening to The Brian Callen Show with your host, Brian Callen.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have Dr. Jordan Peterson of the University of Toronto, otherwise known as Toronto, but I like to pronounce it as if I were Spanish, and practicing psychologist and also a professor. Professor, thank you for joining us here on the Brian Callen / Hunter Mott Show, and looking forward to getting your thoughts on, I think you sort of made a couple of videos talking about how political correctness might get in the way of, good ideas, might get in the way of good discourse that can lead to favorable results. We've got a lot of challenges in the world, and I certainly have felt some of this myself, where you have to be very careful how you speak about all kinds of things because you may be labeled a racist, a sexist, or all of the above. So maybe you could start by talking about what your struggle has been in this arena.
Well, there's a series of Canadian laws that have been put in place over the last few years, both at the mostly at the provincial level so far, so equivalent to the state level, but more recently, the same legislation is likely to be passed at the federal level. And on the surface of it, in some sense, it looks innocuous. It adds gender identity and gender expression to the list of identities protected by the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code, but it actually makes discrimination against, it purports to make discrimination against anybody in those two categories into hate speech. And the problem is that those two categories are very ill-defined and very broad. So, and I looked up the background policies on the Ontario Human Rights Commission website that describe the surrounding attitudes for similar legislation at the provincial level, and it's really quite appalling. I mean, the most appalling part of it I found so far was that there's now a legal requirement to use people's preferred pronouns. Otherwise,
there's a legal requirement. So there's a legal requirement.
There is a legal requirement.
And what happens if I don't apply? First of all, do we have hate speech laws in our country, in the United States? Anybody know? I mean, in other words, what happened to freedom of speech?
Well, but that is the question. I mean, look, most of the time when there are limits put on free speech, the limit is what you can't say. So there are certain things you can't say. So, for example, in Canada, you can't deny the Holocaust. And it's very unreasonable to deny the Holocaust.
But you can in my country. In my country, you can say it was all a myth. I mean, I can do a podcast and say that the Holocaust never happened, and I'm not going to get put in jail or anything else.
Yeah,
I might get publicly shamed, but
there's no hate speech exception to the First Amendment.
Okay,
for the record,
which I know you might think I'm crazy, but I believe in my Constitution. But keep going.
No, that's okay. You can believe in the Constitution. That seems like a fine idea to me. Yeah. Well, the legislation here, there was two reasons why the legislation bothered me. Two main reasons initially, although there are many more reasons subsequently. The main reason was that I don't like the made up gender neutral pronouns, so-called gender neutral pronouns like ze and zer. I feel that if they were appropriately constructed, people would have picked them up all by themselves without needing the heavy hand of legislation, especially hate crime legislation, to enforce their use. I also regard those pronouns as part of the speech patterns and that are characteristic of radical leftist ideologues of the sort that have invaded the university and bent academia beyond redemption, I think, in some ways, and now that are spilling over en masse into institutions outside the university. I don't want to speak their language. I don't like their made-up words. I don't like their attitude. I don't like their ideology. I don't like anything about them, and so I'm not using their damn words.
So and they're trying to make it a crime for you to not use their words. If you
well, it's already a crime in New York City, just so you know it. If you misgender someone in New York City, you can be liable for a fine of up to $250,000. And New York City has put 31 different gender identities into the protected category.
I mean, when did this happen? My God.
Yeah, my God. Yes, you might say that, all right. It happened about 2 years ago. And
How would you go about, how in the world would we
I think
go?
the thing, just to clarify for our listeners, can we talk about what these pronouns are? Because I'm sitting here with a list of them, and as far as I can tell, there are 45 different ones. So it's not just he, she, they, right? What are some of the other ones? You said sie and zer. What does that connote?
Yeah, well, they're neutral, right? Hypothetically, so that connotes a neutral position on what is purported to be a gender spectrum, and so the idea is that people have the right to choose their gender identity, which I suppose is something I don't have a fundamental problem with. You have a right to be however you want to be. The question is, what right do you have to the words that I use? Now, I don't think the people who originally produced the legislation, even in New York City, realized that gender identities were going to multiply from 2, or let's say 2.1 to 50 or 58, which I think is the Facebook. I know, well, Facebook already lists 58, and there are lists of 70 online.
This is madness. To me, it's madness.
But I think it's important that we first talk out the madness, because otherwise, if you just sort of talk about, like, the whole trans issue, well, it can often seem to people that this is a reasonable thing. And in sort of, in general, in terms of the whole bathroom thing in North Carolina, fine, use whatever bathroom you want. But what is going on college campuses is the extreme phenomenon of this, where we could talk
about transsexuals for a moment. The vast majority of transsexuals actually want to be referred to by the pronouns he and she. Mm-hmm. They just want to be referred to the pronouns he and she in accordance with either how they dress or how they've transformed themselves surgically. So if you're a male to female transsexual, almost universally you want to be called her or she. Yeah. And if you're a female to male, you want to be called he or him. And so this isn't an issue that even affects the vast majority of transsexuals. It affects a very tiny minority of people who don't believe that they fit into any standard gender category, and then which is also on their own particular choice. The issue is what effect that has on broader society and other individuals, especially with regards to language use. And so it's conceivable that we could learn how to use they as a singular, except that we'd have to sacrifice the distinction between singular and plural, which I think is a very bad idea, which is why I don't think people do it. But to multiply that to the place where all 31 gender identities protected by New York law each have their own pronoun is absolutely untenable. There's not a possibility people are going to be able to do that.
It's another law that's not, you can't really practice. It exists on the books. You're not going to, there are certain, I think sodomy in certain states of the Union in the United States are still illegal.
It's unenforced, but that doesn't, but I think the point is that left to given their druthers, these people would enforce this law.
They're Stalinists.
I wouldn't go so far as to say it's unenforced. It may not have been enforced en masse yet, but that doesn't mean it won't be. It's very difficult to not enforce laws once they're on the books.
How did they get these through? How in the world didn't cooler heads prevail? Why?
I think it's partly that. Look, I've seen what's happened in Canada since I've started this talk. To begin with, I was first attacked by people who said something like, "Why can't the mean professor just call people what they want to be called?" And so there's a compassion, false compassion, I would say, or an overblown compassion behind it, predicated on the presumption that calling people what they want to be called is going to be simple, which it isn't, and also predicated on the idea that if you call people by their preferred pronouns, there's indisputable evidence that that's going to be in their best interest. And I think there's no evidence whatsoever that that's going to be in people's best interest. Right. So, I was thinking it through more practically. If you're a transsexual or someone who doesn't fit on the in the binary gender categories, and you present yourself for a job interview along with your demands that your coworkers and your boss and all of the customers that you're going to come into contact with have to bend their language around to suit you, or they'll be the targets of fairly heavy-duty lawsuits. I can't imagine that that's going to do a hell of a lot of good for your attempt to
get a job,
find your place in society, shall we say?
Yeah,
not going to shop at that store.
Yeah, of course, that's what I mean. It's not practical. It makes it's just, it's a preemptive strike. It's just so aggressive and so...
But it also ignores the fact that there's a practical component here. And I think practical is not a thing that is often thought about on college campuses. And that practically...
No, it's thought about less and less on college campuses.
Hold on. But I mean, the point is that language is a tool. And cultures invent words to solve very specific cultural problems. But, they come to these sort of fairly standard set of pronouns. Like you're saying, they mean something. They means a group of multiple individuals. And so, to then take that word and give it another meaning degrades what is a linguistic tool that is developed over a long period of time.
It also feels like you're opening up a window to a whole, this is a can of worms. If the Canadians don't believe in freedom of speech and protect freedom of speech, or at least allow me to use the words I choose, including offensive words, you guys are in big trouble, because that's just the tip of the iceberg. This is where
that's the case I've been making. So, people often defend free speech on the grounds that we have the right to criticize our leaders, but that's not the right defense for free speech. Free speech is the mechanism that keeps individuals and societies in balance. And free speech enables us to identify and articulate problems, and to identify potential solutions and to discuss them, and then to reach consensus. And so any constraints on free speech should be put into place with exceptional caution. And free speech isn't just another value like equality or achievement, let's say. It's instead it's the machine by which we negotiate our lives, both individually and collectively. It's the fundamental value of Western society, and I say that not lightly. It's rooted in conceptions that are far outside the political, much deeper than that, and rooted in ideas that honest speech is the fundamental moral obligation of every citizen and every soul, for that matter. So, and I think that there's a full-fledged assault on truth going on in the universities right now, and I'm not alone in that proposition. Jonathan Haidt, who's a very admirable and respectable psychologist,
and a friend of this podcast.
We've had him on the podcast,
and a big fan of Brian's stand-up.
Yeah. So you know Jonathan, Dr. Haidt's work, and he just made a video or a podcast a week ago stating that universities are going to have to decide between social justice and truth. I just said social justice and free speech. He went farther than that, social justice or truth. And, I believe that his statement is very much worth paying attention to.
Well, I think people are, and a lot of these colleges are losing their donations from reasonable adults who are saying, I don't know what you're teaching here, but you are creating these Stalinistic, committees, and you're not about the free flow of information and ideas and making it a safe place for people to disagree with you or come up with a better way at all. And so I'm not giving you my money anymore. That's really what's going to have to speak. I think this is going to be a snake eating its own tail. And I have to say, Doctor, that when I hear this stuff, it's so nuts and it's so fanatical that ultimately fanatics like Islamic fundamentalists, like the communists in Mao's China, ultimately they get they lose their relevance. It's not operable. This is not an operable set of laws.
Yeah, but they can do a lot of damage.
They can do a lot of damage, which they have to be fought against.
You look at the Soviet Union and Maoist China. The estimates for the Soviet Union are between 30 million and 60 million deaths in internal oppression alone between 1919 and 1959.
That's right.
Perhaps up to 100 million in Maoist China.
Yeah, that's right. So the fact is, you're right. When the wrong ideas win the day, people die. Yes, they certainly do. And truth dies first, and then people die. And what's happening on the campuses is no joke. Men are bailing out of the universities like mad, which is also... I'm not sure exactly how those two things are related, but... What do you mean by that?
Well, I think you do know how they're related. It's not a fun place to be a man right now.
Well, that's true. The enrollment of men in universities is plummeting.
Well, I just got into hot water. I did a podcast where I was trying, and I did it in a clumsy way, to articulate the difference between various sexual assaults, I suppose. I know there's sexual assault, and I'm not clear on the language, but what I was trying to say essentially was that when someone is pulled into an alley and raped, we need to have language for the difference between something horrendous like that and this boorish asshole who pushes you against the wall and tries to kiss you. That's also awful. But if we lose the distinction and lose the ability to start talking about the distinction socially, I know there's a legal distinction, but if we lose it socially and we lump everybody in, and and by the way, if you say something very offensive the way Trump did, and then you say that's the same as rape, I think and I was trying to articulate that, and boy, did I hear it from a whole bunch of people.
You made this point at the beginning of this discussion that you have to be allowed to, and even encouraged to, formulate your arguments badly to begin with.
Well,
because otherwise
that's
you
right.
can't formulate them well. And look, one of the really odd things that happened in the last couple of weeks to me was that at the same time that the queer caucus of the Canadian Union of Public Employees at the university went after me for hypothetically creating an unsafe campus environment, I had another president of the union in my office who represented the librarians, and he is terrified about the university's new sexual harassment policy and couldn't find anybody in the administration to have an intelligent talk about it with. So he came to talk to me, of all people, because he was so concerned about it. And his concern is exactly the one that you just expressed, is that the new language surrounding sexual harassment is so vague and all-encompassing that it risks criminalizing normal misunderstandings.
Exactly.
And the fact that it's something that people who are concerned about heinous sexual assault should be opposed to, because you dilute the most terrible of crimes by lumping them into the same category as the most unfortunate of misunderstandings.
Well, Hunter said it's like the difference between getting slapped and murdering somebody. I know people that have, and myself, I've punched people in bars. Okay, well, I was a young guy or whatever. Let's just take that as an example. One time this guy words in a bar, and I punched him as hard as I could in the face. Now, that doesn't make me a murderer. I hit him in the face. Now, I'd be considered, that is assault if I got caught for it, but we have to make a difference. We just have to, the society is predicated on identifying and knowing that difference and being able to talk about that difference.
Well, I was on a TV show, a Canadian public TV show 2 days ago, and with a particularly unsavory, politically correct professor from the University of Toronto, who I thought was an absolutely appalling intellectual opponent, and he accused me of abusing my students. And the host of the show said, "Well, do you really think that that's abuse?" And he said, "Yes." And so I said, "Well, do you think it's violence?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Do you think it's a hate crime?" And he said, "Yes."
Wow.
And so now my refusal to use Z is in the same category, as far as he's concerned, as inciting hatred against a particular ethnic group or denying the Holocaust. And
this guy's scholarship sounds laughable. He sounds like not a very deep thinker.
Well, he also claimed that the scientific consensus is now that there's no biological difference between male and female.
Oh my God!
He said that on public television.
Oh my God!
And believe me, this is the sort of thing that's being taught.
Wow, that's my problem with the progressive liberal feminist narrative, is they never include biology into the equation. My God, if you talk about testosterone and what it does to the brain, you are in big trouble. And they did this in the 70s, they did this in the 80s, and they did this in the 90s, and they're doing it now.
Yeah. Well, the social justice warriors are definitely going to go. They're going to go after the psychiatrists and the biologists next. I can already see it coming.
But I think
they're going to go after the biologists, because I think that under Canadian law, now at least Ontario law, it's against the law not to be a social constructionist.
What does that mean?
Well, a social constructionist is someone who believes that all the differences between men and women are a consequence of culture, that there are no biological differences.
Flies in the face of science.
Well, it's completely insane. It's completely insane. It's part, but there was an article in the New York Times the other day, and I can't remember who wrote it, but their solution to the problem with gender friction, let's call it, is to just eradicate gender altogether. So we'll just act as if there's no difference between men and women.
But good luck.
And there's lots of people who want that to happen.
But it's not. But again, when you look at the world and society, it's just the craziest. It's not so. It's madness. And these people, this tiny group of radicals and fanatics, and by the way, they're not interested in equality. They're interested in power. They have no interest in equality. They're not. These are not.
I
these are
think
not
they're
good
more
people.
interested in. I really think they're more interested in revenge than anything else.
I do too.
So, and they're not a tiny group. Don't be thinking that. I did some mathematical calculations a while back. They're back of the envelope sort of things, but I figure that the women's studies and gender studies departments alone, so the more radical end of the university, has produced between 300,000 and 3 million fully trained social justice warrior political activists who know exactly what they're doing, and that's like 1% of the North American population. That's not a tiny minority. That's the really committed ones. There's at least, I would say, 5 times that number that are perhaps not quite so radical nor so well trained.
Yeah.
Whole societies have been turned upside down by far smaller minorities than that.
This is true.
But aren't you speaking from a position of your white, heterosexual, cisgendered privilege? Like, doesn't that need to be factored in, Professor?
Yes, apparently. Well, that's the other thing, is that the other thing that really bothers me about all this is that there's absolutely no recognition whatsoever on the part of these radicals that hierarchies can exist for any reason other than arbitrary power. They don't believe in competence. They don't believe in ability. They don't believe that hard work can put you in a place
of authority.
That hard work can elevate your status. They believe the entire system is corrupt and should be torn down.
Yeah,
and so they're perfectly willing to. So for when they talk to me, for example, they don't see me as a professor or as an authority. They don't take into account the fact that I've spent 20,000 hours as a clinical psychologist untangling people's deepest personal problems, another 15,000 hours writing, and at least that much time speaking. I have a certain expertise at this, but as far as they're concerned, that's all a consequence of arbitrary distribution of power. They don't recognize any distribution of power other than arbitrary.
Amazing. That's amazing.
And that's postmodernism in a nutshell.
Well, what has been your life like on the university campus? Do you have people coming up to you and saying, I mean, what is going on here for you?
Well,
personally?
I keep to myself a fair bit, generally speaking. I do a lot of work at home on my computer. When I go into the university campus now, it's not a problem. I'm more self-conscious walking around the campus than I used to be.
Right.
But I suspect I'll probably get over that. But I'm not really concerned about it.
Right. You're not being censored yourself.
But so, Professor...
Well, the university sent me 2 letters asking me, first of all, asking me to silence myself about this issue and pointing out that as I suggested in my initial video, that what I was doing was probably illegal. Because I said in the video that the act of making the video could itself be illegal. And they seem to have concurred, because they told me in the second of 2 letters they sent me, and I made YouTube videos out of this. I read the letter and also my response on Jordan Peterson, if anybody's interested. I think 120,000 people have watched the 3 videos now in total. But they seem to also agree that what I did was illegal, and under the current Ontario legislation, if you employ someone and they say something that's, let's say, hate speech, then you're also responsible for it. As if it was you that said it.
It's nuts.
It is. It's madness.
Well,
and I think that part of the reason that this is being passed, because, we've been trained to be hyper-tolerant, and it's easy to be nice to people. You say, well, we'll use whatever language people want. Nobody gives that a second thought. But if you don't think about that and you ignore what's going on long enough, you end up in a position where there is actual threat to freedom of speech, and I think we're well past that point now. The campuses have gone crazy. My advice to people is to, well, a student wrote me the other day, and he said he went to university. He's a guy, and he said he just couldn't handle it because he was so alienated by the discourse, aimed at his white privilege, for example. He dropped out and became a mechanic. And so I wrote him back and I said, well, that was probably a hell of a good idea. It's not that easy. Well, it's not that easy to be a good mechanic, and you can be a good person and be a mechanic, and you can do something useful for society. And right now you send your kids to university, there's a decent chance that their mental health is going to be undermined, and they're going to be transformed into, like, babbling puppets of neo-Marxist, of resentful neo-Marxist ideologues.
That's right.
You shouldn't pay $120,000 to have that done to your child.
And studying gender studies. Good luck getting a job on. Christine Summers, who wrote a book called The War on Boys. She'll go to college campuses and say, who majored in gender studies? And they raise their hands, and she basically says, well, good luck getting a job in the real world. You probably wasted 4 years.
There are places you can get jobs with that kind of degree.
Yeah,
now.
other academic institutions.
No, it's not just that. You can get a degree. You can get a job with a degree like that in human resources in big corporations.
Oh yeah,
and
or at HuffPo.
The vanguard for the politically correct into large corporations is through the human resources, or often also known now as human resources and equity.
Oh,
so don't be thinking that these people aren't getting employed. They're getting employed, and they're getting employed in plenty big corporations, who are now hyper concerned with equity, partly because of legislative transformations.
How do we fight this back besides talking about it and formulating the opposition? How do you fight this madness?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I produced some stickers. It's a kind of a trivial thing to do, but I thought that people might want something, at least something basic that they can start doing. So I produced a bunch of stickers that are now on sale on eBay, and I'm hoping that people will put their no PC stickers, like no smoking stickers, although they're not quite as in your face. I'm hoping that people will place them on posters on campuses and in other organizations that are politically correct, so that it can be signified that at least someone noticed. I think people also have to start pushing back and saying, when they hear this constant noise about what group identity you belong to point out that that's actually the most fundamentally biased and racist thing that you can do, to identify people only by their group affiliation and to make that the cardinal element of their identity. It's appalling.
Yeah.
It's appalling. And it's going to cause a lot of trouble. It's already causing a lot of trouble.
But to go back to something Brian said earlier in the podcast, right? He talked about a snake eating its tail, right? The Ouroboros, right? Mm-hmm. And isn't that, I mean, we've had so many people on this show. We're over 200 episodes now. You'll be 220. And one of the people that we've had on multiple times is Richard Nisbett, who studies cultural differences. Yeah. And part of that is those East-West cultural differences. And to me, it seems like what you're seeing going on academic campuses in the U.S. is the ultimate conclusion of Western culture. You have rationalism, so that people are saying whatever weird shit they're saying and they think they're being rational, but really they're just rationalizing feelings they barely understand, which as a psychologist I'm sure you run into very often.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, it's also that atomistic mindset where you just keep on looking at a smaller and smaller piece of the world and you lose all sense of context and proportion.
No, it's also, I agree with that. It's also the unmooring of our culture. So, it's about 140 years since Friedrich Nietzsche announced the death of God. And people don't read what he wrote. He didn't say, God is dead. He said, God is dead, and we have killed him, and we'll never find enough water to wash away the blood. Wow. And Nietzsche prophesied back in 1880 that there would be millions of people killed in the 20th century by communist revolutionaries, because he knew that once our fundamental religious beliefs were demolished by rationalists, that we would careen back and forth between ideological extremes, and that's exactly what's happening.
It seems to be so. Religion was more the anchor for and the bulwark against sort of ideological extremes that seem to.
It is precisely that, and that's its psychological. That's its psychological function. Wow. I wrote a book in 1999 called Maps of Meaning, and that's what I spent $15,000 writing, and it was an examination. It's very influenced by Carl Jung, and Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, of course. Yeah. Was a very astute student of Nietzsche. People think of him as a Freudian disciple, but that's really not true. He was really a Nietzschean, and he spent his entire career trying to determine how people could cope with the loss of the highest value that Western culture had yet created. Mm-hmm. And so I read everything Jung wrote, except the stuff that's been published in the last 5 or 6 years, and spent a tremendous amount of time studying comparative mythology. It's quite funny that you talked about the snake that eats its own tail. That's the Ouroboros. That's a symbol of chaos. Mm. And so that's exactly what comes back up when order is under assault. It's chaos that rises, and chaos breeds many monsters. That's the oldest stories we know tell us that.
I feel as though the greatest enemy in a lot of ways is just the apathy that I see around me, where people don't even want to have these discussions. They don't even know they exist, and they're not really interested in formulating any of these thoughts. They're exposing themselves to these thoughts.
But why does that apathy develop?
Well, I think partially because
Well,
they don't see they don't see the danger yet.
Well, but also
you
I
never
think
have to explain apathy.
Yeah.
Apathy is the default condition because it's easy.
Yeah.
But apathy is not so bad. Willful blindness is what's really bad. That's when you should know but you refuse to. And I think right now apathy is actually, in some sense, a signal that culture is working okay, because people assume that there aren't problems so that they can attend to their own personal business. And often that's good.
Right.
But the problem is it's not always good. And right now there are things happening. And, people also think, well, this is just a university problem. It's like, there is no such thing as just a university problem, because universities are the people who train the people who will be leaders in 15 years.
That's right.
And so,
right.
It's also, I think it's willful blindness on the part of university administrators, who also have their own particular iron in the fire, because they're dependent on happy students to continue generating the excess tuition fees that keep their salaries paid. And there's an evil little, what would you call it?
Cabal.
Yeah, well, look what's happened in the United States is tuition costs have rocketed northward. A number of administrators has skyrocketed. Student debt has ballooned out, and it's illegal to default on your student loan. You can't declare bankruptcy. And so what the universities have done is enticed students into forfeiting their future for their tuition costs.
Amazing.
It's like indentured servitude.
Yeah,
it's a modern form of indentured servitude. And it's absolutely appalling.
And isn't it also on top of that then the part of the problem is that once the prices have skyrocketed northward, the kind of people that you're attracting inevitably tend to be very much from that liberal tribe. So there ends up being less and less intellectual diversity. You're not necessarily getting the guy who, grew up poor in the backwoods of Louisiana. You're only getting a bunch of people who went to fancy private schools.
Yeah, well, there's some sort of positive feedback loop developing, where once like Jonathan Haidt has documented this quite nicely, as have a number of other people. At Brown University, the ratio of Democrats to Republicans is 65-1.
Oh my God.
It's 35-1 at Berkeley.
Good God.
And it's like, look, 10-1. Okay, fine, whatever. You got to keep the odd token Republican around just to keep things balanced. But, 65-1. Obviously what's happened there is that there's been a homogenization of viewpoints on the campus at the same time that everyone is yelling as loudly as possible about the necessity for diversity, as if intellectual diversity, and this is the most malevolent and pernicious claim of the radical left, is that the way you get diversity of ideas by diversity of race and gender. As if our ideas are linked inextricably with our race and gender.
There's
nothing more racist and sexist than that claim.
I agree with you. Yeah, that makes complete sense.
But
formulating these
appalling.
Arguments, we have to win you got to win the idea, the battlefield of ideas, and that seems to be the most important thing.
Well,
that's what you hope, because if you don't win on the battlefield, if we can't settle things on the battlefield of ideas, then the next step is conflict, and we don't want to go there.
No, I know.
Now, what's happened at the University of Toronto, interestingly enough, after they sent me the second letter telling me that it would be best if I kept my mouth shut about these sorts of topics, I went and talked to the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science, who is the main signatory of the letter. And he's quite a reasonable person, and I think a person, at least, insofar as people's hearts are ever in the right place, his is probably in the right place. And I suggested that the right way forward through this would be for the university to host a public debate so we could actually talk this through, because this has been constantly in the media. These little videos I made and put on YouTube, they've been constantly in the national media now in Canada for a whole month.
Wow.
It's unbelievable.
Well, at least you're getting it out there and people are talking. This is important. It's always one person who has to do that and then get it going. Thank God.
Well, I think what happened too was that I nailed political correctness to an actual issue, because there's lots of videos decrying political correctness.
Yeah.
But I think the reason that this caught the attention it did catch, including the 3 million people who have now watched the free speech rally assaults at the University of Toronto online, I think it's because I actually said there was something I would actually not do. Because I think you have to take a general problem and make it specific before a real discussion can occur. And I said that I wasn't going to use these damn pronouns. And so that of course, got the transsexual No, I can't say that. That got the gender non-binary activists up in arms, along with their allies. And of course, they first of all
fanatics.
They first of all accused me of saying that transsexual people didn't exist, which is nothing. I never did say that. But see, it also tells you why fighting back against this is so difficult, because to me, it's only a fluke in some sense that this issue happened to center on issues that concern a small minority of transsexual people. It could have been any other group. It just happened to be them. But as soon as you put your foot down somewhere, then the group that happens to be affected by that refusal, or at least thinks so, then puts themselves forward as victims of your bigotry, and like the left comes unglued. And so, for example, one of the things that happened was 200 people signed a letter essentially denouncing me. They have about 70 of them were faculty members, and the rest of them were graduate students and people like that.
Wow. Yeah. Faculty members too.
Oh, yes. Well, and in exactly the sorts of disciplines that you would guess at, like the gender studies people and the people who run the Ontario Institute of the Studies on Education, which is also a rat's nest of leftist political ideology and misinformation. And they're the ones who train many of the teachers in Ontario who go out to teach elementary students and junior high students, and that's all become insanely politicized.
Of course it is.
So, but wait a minute, Doctor, what about otherkin? Are you familiar with otherkin?
No, I'm afraid that's something that hasn't caught my attention yet.
Well, that's
that is.
That's the next frontier once we move beyond non-binary gender identities, is otherkin, which are people who identify as non-human. They believe that they are mythical creatures, including angels, demons, dragons, elves, fairies, sprites, aliens, and cartoon characters. And some claim
they might be cartoon characters. That could be true.
Yeah.
But I think that's the point is, because I think part of it is that, we... since we're all fans of Jonathan Haidt's work, we do have these moral intuitions. And, a large part of this is it's hard for us to sort these things out because we have all these strong feelings about, well, I don't know, like, shouldn't we just do what makes people comfortable? Like, shouldn't we be tolerant? Isn't that a good thing? But I think it's important to help people see that this has now reached a place of such ridiculousness. And I think also crucially, the
not just ridiculousness, but downright has the potential to do real harm. Imprison
it's gone
people,
past ridiculous into dangerousness.
Yeah,
that's right.
Imprison people, fine people. This is violence.
Yeah.
This is a violent. In many ways, this has the potential to do physical, emotional, and financial harm.
The guy that I debated on TVO, I mean, he said right publicly that as far as he was concerned, I was a hate criminal.
Wow.
And you know what you do with hate criminals? It's not pretty. Put it that way.
Wow. This guy sounds like a maniac.
But that's I
fanatic.
think what I found in terms of Haidt's work is you have to bring things into conflict. So it's because they're both sides are claiming there's violence, right? But the question is, what is the greater violence, to use the wrong pronoun with someone or to ruin the career of a psychologist who has 20,000 hours of helping people?
Exactly.
What's the greater evil?
That's right. That's a fundamental question which we need to start talking about.
Yeah, but you have to put these things. I mean, because
you're talking about neurotics. You got a small group of neurotics who are controlling the discourse and actually pushing their radical.
Don't be thinking they're so small. Remember, at Brown University, they outnumber people. The other side, 65-1.
They would be very at home in Mao's China, Pol Pot's Cambodia, Stalin's Russia. But they would be very at home in these circles. This is so classic. History continues to repeat itself.
It is.
But it has to be. I agree.
Of the same thing.
Yeah, and I agree. It has to be fought against. It has to be fought against with everything. This is very important.
But also, Professor, as a psychologist, how would you, what would you say about the psychology of these people who...
Oh, well, we know we're going to release a paper next week, and before publication. We're just putting the finishing touches on it now. We've already done the psychometric analysis of political correctness.
Yeah, so
properly, too.
What would you tell me if I came in as a patient and I asked you to refer to me as per self?
What would I say about that?
Yeah, well, how would you help me deal with that?
I would say that if you wanted to have a clinical discussion with me, that those sorts of things are discussed before we agree on them.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know why. I want to know that it's in your best interest. I want to know that you've thought this through. I want to know that your claim isn't part of the psychopathology that brought you to see me to begin with.
Yeah.
I'm not just going to agree on, like, if someone comes to me and says that they're Jesus Christ, then we're probably going to have a discussion about that.
Yeah.
Because it's incumbent on me to understand why it is that a person is making that demand on me on first meeting.
But
so give us the psychological profile that you have come up with now.
Oh, sure, it's quite straightforward. I mean, there are many details which I won't go into, but I'll make this most straightforward claim. The first thing is that we certainly found that political correctness exists. There are groups of ideas that hold together because people believe all of them at the same time. We found two types of belief that characterize the politically correct domain. One is radical egalitarianism, and so those would be those are the politically correct people that other people confuse with liberals because they're not the same as liberals, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And the other group is the language police types, and those are left-wing authoritarians. And so what the two groups have in common is that they're very high in trait agreeableness. Now, liberals are high in openness. That's one of the big five traits, right? There's extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. So the difference between liberals and conservatives is that liberals are very high in trait openness and low in conscientiousness. And conservatives are high in conscientiousness and low in openness. And so what that means is that from an economic perspective, for example, what that means is liberals are much more likely to start companies and start creative enterprises, and conservatives are much more likely to run them. So each needs the other.
Okay.
Because conscientious people are very good at being managers and administrators. It's the best predictor of managerial and administrative ability. But openness is the best predictor of creative ability. So it's kind of like the creative types versus the managerial types.
Okay.
And every corporation knows about that tension.
Right.
So that's liberals versus conservatives. But the fundamental personality attribute of the politically correct types is trait agreeableness. And agreeableness is the maternal dimension. It's compassion. And so what happens with the politically correct types is they treat everyone who's in distress as if they are a crying infant.
Wow.
And I'm not being smart about this. I'm not being satirical about this.
Yeah.
Like the maternal instinct in human beings, male and female, but particularly female, is very, very pronounced and strong. And so and if you're a mother and you have an infant, say, that's less than 9 months old, it's perfectly reasonable to view all the distress that infant manifests as justified and anything that causes it as bad.
Wow.
But that's not a reasonable lens through which to view the world of adults interacting. And but that's basically what's happening.
That's
so
amazing.
I would say that the political correctness is the rise of the Oedipal mother, the overprotective mother who demolishes her children's ability to reach independence as a consequence of overprotecting them. That's what we see. That's what we're seeing rising on the political front. That's not the only thing we found. We also found that the language police types they're just not very bright. So there's a very powerful relationship. No, it's quite
I believe you
bright.
on that. I believe you.
Yeah. Well, so there's a more the correlation between wanting language control and verbal cognitive ability is about -0.4, which is higher than the relationship between grades in university and IQ. Wow. It's a really strong correlation.
Wow.
We also found that the language police types were more likely to have a psychiatric disorder on the anxiety side, either personally or in family members. And that they were also, both groups, the egalitarian types and the authoritarian types, these are both politically correct types, were also more likely to have undergone some indoctrination.
Yeah.
They were also more likely to be female.
Really?
Well, yes, and yes, exactly. And so it's one of the few situations that we've found as psychologists where there were differences between males and females that you couldn't get rid of by controlling for personality, because most of the differences between men and women manifest themselves at the level of trait personality, that there are profound differences there. And if you control for the differences, usually maleness or femaleness doesn't predict anything additional. But So you could also say, and this is something that's very fundamental as part of what we're facing, is the unresolved issue of female political behavior. Because we actually don't understand female political behavior, because females haven't been part of the general polity, technically, for that long a period of time. We don't know what female tyranny would look like, for example, if it was expressed in public. Well, we're going to find out if we're not careful.
Yep.
And so one of the things that has to happen is that women have to take some responsibility, I would say, for the monsters that are being bred on the left side of the political spectrum. And note that the spilling over of maternal behavior into the political domain isn't appropriate.
And isn't that
adults are not infants? Neither are minority groups.
Isn't that a more general challenge, though, of this moment in history, is that each group has to take responsibility for the monsters within its group? I mean, having spent a lot of time in the Arab world, I mean, that's sort of the challenge, is that, it's the majority of Arabs just sort of want to keep their heads down, and they don't want to confront the wacky fundamentalists. Yeah,
well, the thing is, the majority of Arabs are peaceful, but that doesn't mean that radical Islam is peaceful.
Right. It's a little bit like, when we're all going about our days and living our lives, and we're all, most of the people that I associate with, let's just take as an example, or let's take myself. I think I'm a good person. I believe in fair play. I'm a reasonable guy. I have my flaws like everybody else. And then all of a sudden, this gender kind of mania rears its head, and I'm being told I have to use words I've never they're just invented. They were invented a year ago. And all of a sudden, you're like, it's a nuisance at first. You're like, what's going on? Am I really going to have to talk about this? I felt that way about having to defend, having to sort of explain why Donald Trump would be a disaster for my country. I thought, I've known this guy since forever, like in New York, and he was always kind of this megalomaniac and this egotistical guy who was way more about himself than anything else. And it was just shocking that I had to start arguing for why he wouldn't be a very good candidate for president. It's the same kind of thing. But, when you talk about the fact that they're taking biology out of the gender conversation.
Oh, yeah.
Stephen
They're going to
Pinker,
go after the biologist for sure. Yeah, Stephen Pinker, he'll be a good target.
He wrote that book, The Blank Slate, which I read, and he was talking about how we went through this in the 70s. And now with science and brain science and all that, all the overwhelming evidence that there are huge chemical, biological, psychological differences between, for example, the male mind and the female mind.
Here's a really funny thing. This is really comical. So, I mentioned that there are pronounced personality differences between men and women. They're pronounced enough so that if you sum up all the personality differences between men and women, there's hardly any overlap between the distributions, even though on each individual trait there's quite a lot of difference. So the big difference between men and women is that women are higher in negative emotion than men, so they feel more anxiety and emotional pain, and their thresholds for experiencing it are lower. And I think that has to do with sensitivity to infant distress cries again, although I think there's other reasons. And the other dimension is that they're higher in trait agreeableness. And so then you might think, okay, well, that's just cultural. Well, here's a comical fact for you. As the Scandinavians have moved towards a more gender-neutral society in terms of their social structures and their political structures, the differences between men and women have got larger and larger until now. Men and women are more different in Scandinavia than they are anywhere else in the world. Yeah. So.
Well, I mean, look, Professor, you can go out to a club or any bar, and majority of women in very progressive cities, wherever they are, whether it's New York or L.A. or whatever, and I travel a lot, women are wearing high heels, a lot of makeup, their hair's done up, they're wearing perfume and short skirts, and they're accentuating their traditional feminine qualities, and men are, lifting more weights than they ever have. Fitness is very important. They're roosters. I mean, the rooster.
Well,
it's.
Did you ever read A Billion Wicked Thoughts?
I didn't.
Oh, that's worth reading. It's the Google engineers doing social science. It's a really comical book. But one of the things they do is analyze male and female pornography use on the web. And so men look at pictures.
Yeah. Women
read pornography.
Wow.
So because they get their pornography verbally. Okay, and so the classic female pornographic fantasy is, wild, savage, untamable man charismatic, brought under the tutelage and control of the single woman that he loves. It's Beauty and the Beast. And the 5 most common archetypal males in female pornographic fantasies are, this is so comical, billionaire, surgeon, pirate, vampire, and werewolf.
And werewolf. Oh, gee.
Yeah. And so
what is this book called? I want to read this. Can you?
It's called a billion wicked thoughts.
I'm gonna. That's going on my next 1 hour special.
So but you saw the same thing happening with 50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah, I was about to say.
I mean, yeah, well, that was the fastest selling novel of all time. And just as our society is moving willy-nilly towards feminized men and masculinized women so that we mush up in the middle in some boring mass, gray mass, you get this fantasy, which was terribly written, about, basically, it's basically S&M fantasy about a virgin who's dominated by an extremely aggressive and sexually forward, to say the least, male. And, it sells millions of copies, and women all over North America are tittering about it tittering about it at each other in en masse. It's like, oh, this was such an exciting book. It's like, it's exactly the opposite of the egalitarian nonsense
of course
that's being forced down everyone's throat. That's why it was so attractive.
What did academia, what did the gender maniacs have to say about that? I wonder.
They have very little to say about that. Believe me. I mean, you have to be a Freudian to have something intelligent to say about that. That's the return of the repressed.
It sure is the return of the repressed. I mean, my God, when you start to repress this stuff.
It just made me laugh. Like, really, it made me laugh every time I thought about it for months. It's like 50 Shades of Grey is the biggest selling novel of all time, and it's women who are buying the novel.
Women are buying. They were running out of the rope in the hardware stores that he uses to tie her up in New York.
Oh, God. I didn't hear.
They had a news story on it in New York in the local press. Women were buying rope. I mean, Jesus Christ.
Yeah,
but also, how much of a role do you think comedy has to play in this? Because isn't it a large part of it that we've just sort of reached this point where the emperor has no clothes? Academic thought on campuses has become so ridiculous.
We'll see. Look, I mean, if you studied Soviet history to some degree, it's like there is almost no limit to the amount of lies people can swallow, and you end up with a society where everyone is lying about everything all the time.
Yeah,
so you would think, well, it's got to the point where it's turned into absurdity. But, comedians themselves are now afraid to go speak on university campuses.
I'm a comedian. I just did, I was in Ottawa and I did that university. But most of my comic friends won't do universities. I personally want to, so I can bring these points up. I'd like to go to Brown and those places. I wonder if they would have me. Probably not, but I think it would be an interesting. I would love to have a discussion with a bunch of these people because I find it amazing.
I think Louis C.K. said he won't go on campuses, and I think that. Of course, the guy who ran that extremely famous show. What's his name?
Dave Chappelle.
No,
Seinfeld.
Even more famous. Seinfeld. Yeah, he said the same thing.
Yeah, well,
and it's not like Seinfeld is exactly. I mean, he's not the world's most outrageous comedian.
One thing we can all agree on, one thing for sure, is that the progressive liberal, extreme liberal left, and I don't want to, I'm not liberals and not, but the people you're talking about, they are thoroughly without humor. There is no humor. It never made me laugh once. I don't know how they live their lives.
They are absolutely without. Well,
tough to
anyone who hates free speech hates humor.
Do they ever?
Because comedians.
Yeah.
Like comedians are the epitome of free speech. They're like the jester in the king's court.
That's right.
The jester was the only person who could tell the king the truth because he was beneath contempt.
Yeah.
Right? So he could say anything he wanted. And comedians, usually, you go watch a good comedian, and basically what he does is say the things that everyone is thinking.
Exactly.
And then everyone laughs. It's like, oh, isn't it funny that we all think that way? And that's how and it's like, yeah, it's funny. We have a comedian in Canada, Russell Peters.
I know Russell.
And Yeah, you know Russell.
Russell's
and,
on my podcast.
It's really interesting watching Russell interact with a huge, like a stadium-sized crowd, because all these different ethnic groups go to see him, and they're just waiting their turn for Russell to like strip the skin off them with a whole sequence of racial epithets, you know, and everyone laughs, ha ha ha, yeah, well, that's kind of what we're like, and you know, he's the sort of person who would be just shut down in a second if the language.
Well, he has Russell's a great guy and also a very smart guy, but Russell also has the benefit of being ethnically Indian, so there's
so he can get that's right, he gets a pass. Yeah. Well, it's funny too. Well, yeah. I've had a number of transsexuals write me, by the way. Far more have written me in support of what I've said than denouncing me. In fact, I don't think I've got a single letter from someone who said that they were transsexual who disagreed with what I said.
Wow.
So the idea as well that these radicals stand for the people that they say they stand for is also completely reprehensible.
Yeah, I think they're two different things. I mean, because someone has always felt like a man and they're a woman and they go for gender reassignment surgery, doesn't mean they're radicals, and doesn't mean they don't have fair minds, and doesn't mean they don't think rationally, and it doesn't mean they
Nobody
agree.
thinks rationally. That's the whole point.
I don't
we have
mean it
to
that
abandon. No, but you do mean it that way. The whole point is
we do think rationally, though, Hunter.
No, we don't. It doesn't exist. It's a myth.
No, hold on. There is a scale. And, you know, I think that everybody who's having this conversation tends to be more rational than irrational when it comes to things like fair play. And what I mean by that is we can assess a situation, take in data, and look at what makes... So in other words, it's irrational, in my opinion, to be...
But where do you
somebody
think,
who is that far left and has no time for and would consider not using lure or whatever the pronouns are, consider that to be a hate crime and you should be jailed. That's more on the irrational scale.
And that's the whole point. Is that what we're reaching? Right? We're reaching the end of an idea of the brain that was made up from the same period when witches were being burned. Like, this is an idea that, you know, Descartes propagated in the 1600s, which is the idea that reason and emotions are separate. And the problem is that what you end up with is that you end up with a bunch of people like these social justice warriors on campus who have all of these emotions of which they're not aware. They're screaming all these random things, and they think that because their beliefs make sense to them, naive realism, what John Haidt talks about, that they're being rational. And so
the rational issue there is an interesting one, because I think this is part of what points to the importance of public discourse, is that it's very difficult not to have your articulated utterances colored by your emotions and your motivations. They're nested inside them. But public discourse can unnest them in some sense, because if you have a discussion, say, between 10 people, each of whom is bringing their own personal perspective to the table, the discussion, if they're all listening to each other, the discussion can spiral upward, so to speak, and you can come up with a solution that it both accurately represents the world so that you can operate in it like a tool-using animal, and promotes a reasonable sort of consensus. So I don't think rationality is impossible, although it may be the net outcome of collective discourse. And that's why free speech is so important too, because free speech helps strip articulated positions of their purely idiosyncratic foundation. And we have to protect that. I mean, that's how we live together as social animals, right? We manage to come up with a consensus that actually functions in the world. And the way we do that is by communicating with each other freely and correcting each other's excessively idiosyncratic perspectives. It does work. It does work.
But I think firstly, I mean, what we're all sort of dealing with, what 2016 has really been about, is that this idea of rationality, people, I think, are really questioning it now. There's just a lot of things that people are doing that they're thinking is rational, but is not. And Doc, I mean, a large part of what, I've done working with students is that I would hear these students say things like, I didn't get the math gene. And that was a weird cultural artifact. Why were they saying this? And basically, I then ended up going through all of the scientific literature and reading the work of people like John Haidt, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, the Damasios at USC, Ekman. And I think the conclusion that comes out of all of that is that, this idea of this state of pure reason where, anybody sees anything clearly, where there's a state where you're not being affected by your emotions or by your learned culture is a myth. And it's
but you can accept that is a part of being a human being and move in the direction
but the point
of
is,
rationality.
No, but you're not moving towards rationality. I think the point is that what prevents the sort of upward spiral that Dr. Peterson is talking about is the fact that I keep on coming back to the story of the blind man and the elephant, right? You have these blind men, they come along, they try and figure out the elephant, right? And one feels the tail and, he thinks that it's a rope. Another person feels the trunk and they think it's a snake, right? Mm-hmm. They all draw these ridiculous conclusions based on limited amounts of information. But always in versions of this story, there's injected this idea of a king. And the king is cited, and he comes along, and he sees that it's an elephant. And the problem of rationality is it creates the idea of a king in a conversation.
Okay. So I need to comment on that because I think I'm familiar with all the people that you've read.
Yeah.
And I would also recommend, if you would be so kind, to take a very hard look at some of the deeper psychoanalysts, because I think Jung, for example, actually solved that problem. Let me give you an example. So imagine that your discourse is inevitably colored by your emotions and motivations. Mm-hmm. All right, so, and it is. So Dan Simon's famous experiments with the invisible gorilla.
Yeah.
Okay, so what Simon showed was that what you see depended on what you were aiming at, mm-hmm. fundamentally. So imagine that what most fundamentally colors your cognitive output is your goals. Mm-hmm. And the goals are a consequence of an agreement that's reached between your emotional and motivational systems, roughly speaking.
100%.
So you posit a goal. Okay, so now the question is, what goal should you posit so that you orient yourself properly with regards to your discourse? Now, let me give you an example. Do you remember the movie Pinocchio?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, do you remember at the beginning, Geppetto is hoping that Pinocchio will become a real individual, right? He doesn't want him to be a marionette. He doesn't want to have to pull his strings. So the entire movie is about this puppet who's learning how to be individual and not having someone pull his strings. Well, when Geppetto first formulates his intent, he wishes on a star. And what that means is there's a very deep meaning to that, a very deep symbolic meaning. It means he lifts his eyes above the earth and picks the most transcendent value that he can speak to, which is his paternal wishes for the best possible outcome for his son. And it's that wish that catalyzes Pinocchio's individual development. And so that idea that there's a king is actually an accurate idea. The king is the proper king of the motivational and emotional systems. And one of the things that you see emerging in archetypes, for example, like the archetype of the hero, is the archetype of the hero. The hero is the king of the values that are put forth by the motivational and emotional systems. And the hero is the person, for example, who goes out to slay the dragon and to get the gold. And that's a matter of courageous exploration and willingness to learn. That's part of it. So this idea that there should be something that the mixture of motivations, emotions, and rationality is subordinate to, that's already been solved from an evolutionary perspective, and it's incorporated in religious symbolism. And it's like psychologists don't know this because they know the literature that you just described, which I know very well, by the way. I've been studying those guys for 30 years. But those people do not know the deep psychoanalytic literature, and they know nothing about mythology or archetypal psychology or religion. And that's a big problem because the problem of who should be king, that's already been solved, and it's been solved from an evolutionary perspective. So,
with the idea of God or what have you? Well,
it's more, in Western culture, it's more the idea of the logos. So the logos it's a Christian idea fundamentally, although its roots are much older than Christianity. And the logos is the communicative action, essentially. And the logos, so that's the word that generated order out of chaos at the beginning of time. It's identified with Christ in Christianity in a very strange psychological twist. But so imagine that when you're facing chaos, which is what we're doing now, what you do is you utilize your logos capacity, logos, of course, being the root word of logic, although logos is much broader than logic, and you articulate yourself out of the chaos.
Right.
And you do that. You do that by orienting yourself properly from a moral perspective, which is to say, you adopt the archetypal role of the hero, roughly speaking, and then you speak forth what you see. And like when I started talking about Nietzsche and Jung at the beginning of this discussion, I did it for a very particular reason. I mean, there's extraordinarily deep thought on this matter, and so the emergence of the archetype of the hero is actually an evolutionarily determined solution to the problem of the conflict of motivations and emotions. And we have hero stories going back, well, God only knows how old the oldest hero stories are.
I've read my Joseph Campbell, indeed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and there isn't. Joseph Campbell knew nothing that he didn't learn from Jung, and Joseph Campbell scraped the surface. Jung is the wellspring.
I need to get back to some Jung. I got to read Jung.
Yeah, I mean he's a very difficult person to read, and of course, most biologically predicated scientists think of him as a mystic, but that's because they just don't understand what the hell he was talking about. He was trying to solve problems they didn't even know existed, like the one we're just discussing, which is who should be king of the discourse. That problem has been solved, and the solution in Western culture is that it's logos that's king of the discourse, and properly so.
But isn't that a solution? I mean, I think that's, to connect it back to Richard Nisbett. I mean, that is the solution of Western culture. And I think what emerges from, at least my reading, is that a lot of these mindsets that we think of are actually complementary. The point is the atomistic and the holistic perspective, or the optimistic and the pessimistic perspective, you emerge with some sort of decent understanding by switching between the two.
Yes, well, that's a dialogue between the two.
Yeah, and
it's
so
a dialogue between the two. Yes,
a dialogue,
and so doesn't a dialogue
the
between
truth emerges in dialogue.
But then doesn't a dialogue between the cultures of East and West isn't the solutions that emerge from that dialogue between East and West better than the solution that either East or West would come up with on their own?
Well, I think it might be more complete. But it's more fleshed out in some sense, so that a lot of the solutions to this sort of problem that were generated, I would say, in an evolutionary process by Christianity and its precursors, are not very well articulated. So, for example, if you look at the dome that covers a Byzantine cathedral, you'll see Christ up against the sky, basically. So he's viewed as a cosmic figure. That's Christ as Pantocrator, or creator of the world. So that's Christ as Word. There's an idea there, and the idea is that there's a cosmic significance to consciousness, because consciousness through speech generates order out of chaos. It's an unbelievably profound idea.
Wow, so consciousness through speech creates cognitive understanding.
It creates order. It creates order out of chaos. Because then that's what you do when you make sense of the world. You face a chaotic situation like the one that we're facing right now, which is a mishmash and jumble of all sorts of issues, emotional, motivational,
and we have a discourse
on
on the meaningful difference between these different concepts, and sort of and you take into account everything from what's worked in the past and everything else to arrive at the best conclusion, right?
Yes, that's right. And what you're doing is you're differentiating the issues using articulation, and then you're producing a synthesis, and you do that. And look, this is unbelievably deep. So let me give you an example. So I think the three of us could agree at the moment that this has been a meaningful conversation.
Yes.
Yes.
I was about to say we need a second podcast, because we're going to have to wrap up soon here. But I need more of you on this podcast.
Let me close with this.
I'm loving this. So, I'm loving it.
All right. So look, the Taoists know that the deepest of meaning is to be found in the space, in the optimized space between chaos and order. That's the space between yin and yang.
Yeah.
That's the Tao. That's meaning. Okay, now modern, especially neurobiologists, especially the atomistic kind, think of meaning as a mere epiphenomena. But it's not. Meaning is how your nervous system signifies to you that you're in the place where information exchange is optimized. It's a real place. And so you feel engaged and outside of time in some sense, and excited and interested, because you're actually in the place and the time where adaptation is being furthered. And that's what human beings experience as meaning. It's not epiphenomena. It's not subjective. It's the deepest reality that we have.
Isn't that the experience of flow?
Well, I would say flow is the weakly secularized version of the manifestation of logos. It's far deeper than flow. It's the most significant of religious experiences, of genuine religious experiences. It's that absolute immersement in the process of meaning and in the process of the generation of chaos out of order, sometimes the reverse, which we don't have to go into. But you have an instinct for meaning, and you can tell when you're engaged in a genuine dialogue because it's exciting and gripping.
Well, by the way, we are in, I could talk about, we just hit the best, most exciting part of it, and we've got to wrap this up. It's killing me. When can we get you back on the podcast? Because we have to continue this. I need more of the rebuttal to Ekman's and those people, John, all of those people.
Well, it's a rebuttal against secularism. I think
I'm very much about that idea.
I have a video online called, there's two of them. One's called The Necessity of Virtue, and the other is called the reality of the sacred. And they're on my YouTube channel. And so if you want to have a discussion, again, and I'd be happy to do that, I would recommend that you watch one of those or both of them. The reality of the sacred is my attempt to lay out the metaphysical landscape. And I've developed that in part to inoculate my students against ideological possession.
God damn, this is this is one of those conversations that's opened my mind to a new possibility. It's fascinating. You're articulating something that I hadn't really heard before.
It goes to a larger issue that I think both of us have been struggling with from different directions about the new atheists.
Yeah. So, Professor, I have to give the studio up to somebody who's coming in now. I've got to go.
No problem.
Listen. Okay. I want you back as soon as possible. Maybe even next week would be great if you're around. Well,
just
I'll have
email
Hunter
me. Just email me. Well, if you want to have a discussion about the last part of this, I'd be more than happy to do this because I can tell you that the thing that we're talking about is by far the most important thing that I've ever discovered.
Well, I'm very interested in it. I want to educate myself. I'm going to watch your videos. Give us the website again that we can go to.
Okay, it's Jordan Peterson Videos.
Okay, Jordan Peterson Videos.
I think it's the second playlist, and it describes. It's got 4 videos on it that I put up.
You need somebody who can package these ideas. You're way too academic. Jordan Peterson Videos is so unhip. Nobody's going to that frickin'. I got to come up with a better, cooler way to describe the stuff you're talking about because I think your thoughts and your discourse is really important and maybe crucial, especially in 2016. And I'm sorry to say that.
So the playlist is called The Alternative to Left and Right Wing Ideological Possession.
Ooh, Jesus, I love it. I am excited. I'm all over that. So
check it out. Check it out. And some of these have been broadcast on public TV in Canada.
Okay, I'm going to watch those, and we're getting you back on the podcast as soon as possible because we need to finish this discussion. You're doing important and good work, and we appreciate you taking your time. Please don't stop fighting the good fight. And keep at it, man. Keep at it.
Okay, well, it was really good talking to you guys.
You're a good man.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
And when I come to Toronto to do stand-up, you have a front row seat, my friend.
Excellent. I love stand-up comedy.
I will make it happen. I really look forward to talking to you, hopefully within next week.
Okay, well, let me know when this is posted, and so I'll tweet it and all of that.
We sure will, and I'll tweet it too. Thank you so much.
Good. Yeah.
Awesome.
Bye.
Bye-bye. That was great. That was just great.
I know.
I loved it. I just love when somebody changes, kind of opens up a new realm of possibility for me, you know?
But, and I think it's been a thing that you've sort of been looking for a long time.
I've called you about it. I've talked to you about it.
But there's a sort of a dissatisfaction that you have with sort of a mundane secularism.
It goes back to, when they were talking about how as the Roman Empire was decaying and breaking apart, they were steeped. They were up to their ears in Greek philosophy. The elite had their children being tutored by Greek philosophers, and somehow that was where the Judeo-Christian ethic, that's where Christianity came out of, out of that. So there is again, it goes back to when you have only rationalists trying to create the architecture for a society, they're not taking into account the fact that we are so much more than that. That's all we have time for today, ladies and gentlemen. I want to get back into this, and we will. So I can't wait to tweet this out.
You've been listening to The Bryan Callen Show with Bryan Callen. Be sure to like him on Facebook. Just search for Bryan Callen Comedy. And follow him on Twitter. Just search for @BryanCallen. You can also find him online by visiting his website. Just go to bryancallen.com. Until next time, bye-bye.